Good morning, U.S. History class. Today is March 25th, 2050, and today I'm going to teach you about the coronavirus crisis that took place 30 years ago. So, in 2019, a virus came from a place called Wuhan, China. It started in December 2019, although in 2020 it got much worse. It spread really easily. It was airborne. You get it by touching things that the infected touched. It started off in China, although it spread to all over Europe, even came to the United States. The places that were hit the hardest were China, Italy, and it came to the US too, and it hit pretty hard here. New York City and Washington State had a lot of cases. Even the county that I lived in here in Georgia had several cases. We don't know exactly where it came from. We know it came from Wuhan, China, but we don't know like the exact way that it originated. It's been hypothesized that it came from a seafood market in Wuhan, China, because some people, after going there, they came down with like pneumonia, and then the sickness then became into the coronavirus. It got pretty out of control really fast. The incubation period is up to 14 days, so I could get it today but not show symptoms until 2 weeks later. So many people would catch the virus, but they didn't even realize it yet. So they would go out in public, touch public things, and then other people would become infected by touching whatever the infected person touched, and it spread really fast that way. In 2020, it became such a severe problem. Hospitals were overflowing. They were like running out of ventilators. There was hardly any room in the hospitals, and countries even went on lockdown. We had to start social distancing, which meant that we weren't even allowed to be within 6 feet of each other, with the exception of being family members. We were only supposed to leave the house when it was absolutely necessary. Like if we needed groceries or had a doctor's appointment, we could leave the house. Although we weren't allowed to go out and socialize with our friends. We couldn't like hang out with each other. We could go outside, although it was really you really weren't supposed to do that unless you absolutely had to. As a result, a lot of businesses started losing money because no one was going to them. Restaurants were losing money because no one was, shopping. Like they weren't eating at the restaurant. The stock market also crashed by about 30%. It was a pretty big deal because so many people were panicking. They weren't like going out to eat. They weren't going out to go shopping. Um, Gas ended up going down to like $1.50 per gallon. So that might have been good for people who want to travel, except for the fact that we weren't allowed to travel. So yeah, a lot of places started shutting down. Grocery stores, though, they were a lot of food was bought from them, and like shelves were empty. For some reason, people started stockpiling up random stuff like toilet paper. We don't know why they did that, but yeah, a lot of food was bought, so there were a lot of empty shelves. It got to the point where the people who are at higher risk, such as the elderly, people with lung issues, they were allowed to go to the store like an hour before everyone else was because they were at higher risk, so they were the ones who need the food the most. It was really the healthy people who were taking all the food. The virus ended up affecting almost everyone in the country, if not everyone. So, as for students, many schools went online. When I was a sophomore, my whole school went online. We had to basically, FaceTime for our classes. Many universities sent their students home. They had to pack up their dorms and then do online lectures from their house. A lot of people ended up having to work from home as well, except for a few. There were several jobs that still required their employees to work full time as if nothing was happening, although there were some other professions, such as doctors, nurses, and grocers, who ended up getting worked overtime. Grocers, most went from like having a part-time job to a full-time job at the grocery store because so many people were like stockpiling food, so they had to go in and restock all the shelves, had to like disinfect everyone. The doctors and nurses, the hospitals became so overflowed that they had to go in and just work overtime to try and help as many patients as possible. Fortunately, no one in my family contracted it. I had no friends or anyone who contracted it. I didn't get it either. The only way that the coronavirus really affected me was that I had online school for several months, and then I also wasn't really allowed to go out and see my friends. One of the things that I remember most about the coronavirus was that people started to get more respect for teachers and retail workers. For example, people like grocers, those were like people thought those were, low skill jobs that anyone could do. People just took them for granted. Although after the coronavirus, people realized, wow, people like grocers are doing a lot of work. They're actually very important to our society. And then as for teachers, it was people always thought that teaching was like a really easy job. You just, give a brief lecture about like something random and then you call it a day, maybe grade a few assignments, give a few tests, but people realized that teachers actually had to put in like a lot of work, especially with coronavirus. I mean, they had to completely change their lesson plans from like in-person things and had to like adapt them so that they could easily be done online and just by a video chat. So in September of 2020, a vaccine was released. It was kind of controversial though because it skipped one of the key tests, which was animal testing. The CDC is supposed to first test their vaccines on animals, although they ended up skipping straight to humans. The reason behind that was because there was this other disease in the past called SARS, SARS, and it was killing a lot of people. It wasn't a pandemic per se, although it was a pretty serious thing. The CDC started working on a vaccine for it. However, the disease kind of just died out naturally before they had it finished. And so, because of how similar SARS and COVID 19 is, they were able to use the SARS vaccine, tweak it a little, and then turn it into a vaccine for COVID 19. So, even though the vaccine came out in September of 2020, the crisis didn't really end until about November. It took a little while for the CDC to distribute the vaccines to all the other countries and states and then have others get vaccinated first. The people who were at higher risk for COVID, such as the elderly, people with autoimmune disorders, people with other lung issues, they were the priority. So they got the first vaccines, and then the rest of society got vaccines as well. Overall, there were about 500,000 deaths worldwide, with most of the deaths being in Italy or Spain, although there were thousands of deaths in other countries such as the United States, Turkey, China, many other countries as well. The 2020 elections were also affected by this. Frick. So the 2020 elections were also affected by this. Normally, what you do is you go to like a voting center and you just vote on the ballot and then you go home. Although, because of social distancing, the government didn't want to risk voters accidentally affecting other people, and then the votes, like the ballots, would get infected and sent to other places. So instead, what they did was they had they sent out ballots, like they mailed them to everyone who was able to vote. They cast their ballots, mailed them to the people who would count them, and then first they had the envelopes sit in a safe space for 2 weeks so that if someone who was infected did cast a vote, they wouldn't infect all like that vote, like that ballot would not infect all the other envelopes or infect the people who were counting. So they waited 2 weeks. So it took a bit longer for the outcomes to be released, although we were still able to have an election. As for what happened with after this, like how we what we did to prevent further pandemics such as this, so the state government started like put more funding into the public hospitals so that if something like this were to happen again, we wouldn't have to worry about space. In Trump's first term, he fired all the people in the pandemic response team. So the government quickly hired a bunch of people to make a new pandemic response team so that they'd have like a whole section of people to prepare for this and make sure that if another pandemic were to occur or even just an epidemic, it would be much better controlled. And then finally, the United States also made it a law that if a pandemic or epidemic of this severity were to occur again and employers still made their employees go to work, they made it a law so that the employer would have to pay hazard pay. Hazard pay is just an extra pay given to the employee as like not like a reward, but just as like compensation for working in like a dangerous situation. In this case, a situation of potentially contracting a lethal disease. When the pandemic was occurring in 2020, a hazard pay, not many companies were doing that. It was a thing for sure, but most employers weren't giving their employees hazard pay, which resulted in lots of strikes. So the United States government, like the federal government, was like, "All right, you employers, you have to give hazard pay if you're going to force your employees to work." There were a few long-term effects after COVID-19 pandemic occurred. For example, as previously stated, the virus did occur in Wuhan, China. So even though it's not the Chinese fault per se, a lot of people, even to this day, still blame the Chinese for the virus. So there is still some xenophobia and racism going on because of it. Another long term effect was that a lot more people started working from home. Because the virus made people work from home, a lot of employers realized how easy it was to actually work from home. That before it was seen as something that was hard to do, you couldn't do it for whatever reason they came up with. This actually made people with like disabilities and chronic illnesses, it made it harder for them to work in an office. And so with employers realizing, oh hey, working from home is actually something that could potentially work and prove to be really helpful, that made it easier. Like the employers realized, oh hey, we can, it's actually like okay to have people work from home. So people with like chronic conditions or disabilities found it a lot easier to work.